Nate. I'm from New Jersey, grew up in Philadelphia, and I'm a seed farmer. The way the talk's going to go, I've got two presentations. The first one explains how I got into what I'm doing, and then the kind of work that I'm doing in New Jersey and with the Experimental Farm Network, which is the nonprofit that I founded a few years ago. I'm from Philadelphia, and a few years ago, while I was working for a union actually, doing organizing work and just kind of gardening in my spare time, I watched this massive destruction come to my neighboring state, New Jersey and New York, in the form of Hurricane Sandy. This is the town of Union Beach, was one of the biggest houses in that town. It's a real working class town along the Raritan Bay, just across from Staten Island. The town was largely destroyed, and like so many places in New Jersey, it really didn't get a lot of attention after the storm, both from the media and from government officials. So I had been involved with Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Philly, and we formed this collective called Occupy Sandy that did hurricane relief work. I started thinking about climate change as more of a social justice issue than just an issue of science. I don't think I quite realized how the effects were already here and as terrible as they were. So the first few slides are just some of the things designed to terrify you about what's coming. This is sea level rise when the ice caps melt. That's where we're headed. It seems pretty inevitable at this point. All of New Jersey is underwater, all of Florida. This is the Muir Glacier in Alaska, 1941 and 2004. Here's a map. This one's really interesting. This is days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see most of the country has fewer than 10 between 1961 and 1979, and then a few places out in the desert where they get a bunch of days above. This is where we're headed under the higher emissions scenario, which is where we currently are. You know, this area here, you know, you got the mountains, so you're gonna only get 20 or 30 days above 100 degrees every year. New Jersey's going to get closer to 60 days every year over 100 degrees. And you know, we're talking 60 years from now, and this could happen even sooner. All kinds of tipping points. This map shows drought versus wet. That decade, 2000 to 2009, most of the US was in drought conditions. This is where we're headed in 2030 to 2039. Extreme drought in the Mediterranean, northern South America, Mexico, and most of the US. And then it's just going to get so much worse. But in addition to all of this terrible drought in so many of the food-producing parts of the world, there's going to be really moist, really wet up in the Arctic. And that's just going to accelerate the melting of the permafrost, which releases more methane into the atmosphere. Most people think about emissions and power plants and everything as a major cause of this. But as you probably know already, agriculture is a huge driver. This is the Global Land Ocean Temperature Index, 1880 here, 2020 here. It's just getting rapidly hotter. This is carbon dioxide as measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. That organization 350.org, we passed 350 a while ago, and that's considered the safe zone, and now at this point we're above 400. People often tell you, if you're looking for an argument, if you ever get in an argument with somebody who's a climate change skeptic or climate change denier, they say it's, you know, this is just natural cycles. Well, this is what the natural cycles looked like for the last 400,000 years, and this is where we are now. So we're well out of that natural range already and headed for worse. This one's really important. This is from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel. In 2014, all of the global greenhouse gases, the major sources are electricity and heat production and agriculture, and mainly deforestation is another 24%. Depending on the numbers, it might be more than that. That's a huge chunk of the total greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. As you also probably know, plants are a wonderful way to sequester carbon in the ground, to capture excess carbon from the atmosphere and pump it into the ground. This is a pretty simplistic image, but that's the basic gist of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the perennial plants that we grow now, and then some of the research that's being done on perennial plants that could become staple crops. Asparagus is a major one. This is little baby asparagus, in case you've never grown it from seed. It takes about 3 or 4 years before asparagus becomes fully productive and starts making spears like that. Asparagus is not considered a staple crop, but it is probably the most popular perennial vegetable that we currently eat. Rhubarb is another one. And then there's all sorts of fruits like strawberries, apples, pears, etc. Garlic is a perennial crop, though it's typically grown as an annual. Sorrel is a tasty herb that's another nice perennial. I'm going to talk most here about perennial staple crops and a little bit about the Experimental Farm Network. About 5 years ago, I was at a Permaculture Convergence in Quebec, and a guy by the name of Eric Tonesmeyer was giving a talk called Perennial Industrial Crops. And he's written a book called The Carbon Farming Solution, and that's a really interesting and useful book about how we could use farming to basically fight climate change. At this point, I was doing the Sandy work. I was pretty much every day engaged in community organizing and doing all kinds of relief work and advocacy for survivors of the storm. My girlfriend at the time kind of told me I should go to this Permaculture Convergence up in Quebec, and I thought, well, it's a long haul, but it should be worth it. It should be fun. But I didn't realize at the time that it was really going to change the trajectory of my life. So sitting in this talk, I heard Eric talking about different perennials that people have worked on for a long time, like perennial wheat is something that people have been working on for 100 years. And probably in the 70s they advanced the farthest, but most of those seeds are gone now. The university programs that were funding it, the funding dried up, and for whatever reason, we don't have perennial wheat anymore. There's still a few, and I'll get to them a little bit later. He talked about things like Osage orange or hedge apple, which probably grows all around here. That could be a source of edible starch. It takes some processing, but that's another kind of potential industrial crop that we're just not really thinking about. He talked about cranberry. Sea kale is the most famous member of that genus, but there are annual cranberries as well that are already used as oilseed crops for an inedible oil, and there's the potential of developing perennials out of that. So it was a really interesting conversation. My biggest takeaway from it was there's so much potential out there, but the work is not being done, and the people who are doing it are working in their own silos. So I had been involved in this grassroots collective hurricane recovery work that was run by volunteers who were organizing mainly over the internet, and we managed to mobilize tens of thousands of people to do the kind of work that FEMA and the Red Cross should be but wasn't doing. So I thought, okay, well, how can we apply this same ethos to the problem of developing perennial plants and revolutionizing agriculture for a changing climate? The Experimental Farm Network was the idea that popped into my head then, and pretty much for the last 5-6 years I've been building that. I'd been involved in an Occupy Philly spin-off called Occupy Vacant Lots, and we were basically what it sounds like, finding vacant lots in the city, working with neighborhoods, working with people to convert those to food-producing gardens. And one of my friends in that was a guy named Dusty, and we both got talking, and he had experience in Minnesota working at an urban farm. He was running an urban farm in Philadelphia, and we both realized we need more land. And I had been collecting rare seeds for a while as well, so I had this huge seed collection that I'd been mostly growing out in my own backyard or in other people's backyards. And so we decided we got to get out of the city. We've got to get some land and start experimenting. So we spent about 6 months looking. We thought we were going to land in Pennsylvania in a preserved farmland, so it couldn't be chopped up. It had to be sold to someone who was going to farm it, basically, or it was just going to sit there fallow. For 6 months, it sounded like they were going to rent it to us. We were talking about how much we were going to pay them every month. And then on April 1st of 2014, they told us, sorry, we decided we just want to sell it. And do you have $1 million? We did not have $1 million. So we posted on Facebook and said, hey, we've got 90 flats of seeds. We've already started in an artist studio in Philadelphia. We're desperate for some land. We got a number of interesting leads, and the next day I got an email from the folks who owned this farm. It's actually much bigger than this picture. I said, hey, can I come by tomorrow? I happen to be driving past that to go to a meeting about hurricane relief down along the Delaware Bay. This is about 35 minutes south of Philly, about 30 minutes north of Delaware Bay, maybe an hour from Cape May in South Jersey. I brought Dusty a few days later, and Chris, the owner of the farm, was already tilling up this portion of their field for us to use, even though we hadn't come to any sort of agreement yet. We basically have a handshake deal with them, and we've now been farming there for the past 4 years. We started farming last year on another property about 6 miles down the road, and Dusty's actually just moved back to Minnesota. I'll talk a little bit more about what he's up to. And I'm looking at buying a farm myself in upstate New York now. We set about on this land kind of trying to remake the landscape. The first couple of years we were doing everything by hand, so this is about 3 acres. It's really nice to have it long because as seed farmers, we want to keep things isolated by distance. So, we can plant one tomato here and another here and keep them about 20, 30 feet apart. Peppers need a couple 100 feet, so we have enough room to do a bunch of those as well. And we started planting perennials because that was obviously something that was really important to us. So this whole section of the field where it's a little bit yellow, those are buttercups. We put in a lot of currants and grapes and pears and apples and some pecans and some interesting crops there. We started trying to cut based on the landscape, some swales, and try to capture the water as best as possible. There's kind of a hill in the middle of the farm here, and that's nice, gives us a little bit of microclimate. It's not high at all. If you're looking at it, it just looks like a field, but for us, it's the hill. The main purpose of the website, the Experimental Farm Network, is to get people collaborating on projects. It's a really simple concept. This is what the website looks like. The idea is anybody can join and post a project and recruit volunteers. And over the long term, volunteers who participate will be rated by the people who they're working with, so that over time we end up with a vetted core of competent growers. And somebody has an interesting breeding project, they can mail seeds out to the 20 people who've signed up for it, and when the people send seeds back at the end of the season or after 2 or 3 seasons, they can get, a 1 through 5 rating. And the idea is we'll end up with a large army of volunteer growers who can participate in the kind of projects that don't get funding from universities, that corporations aren't interested in because there's nothing they can patent and there's no chemicals to go along with it. There's not as much money to be made. And some of these things are really slow. This one, Monkey Puzzle Tree Proliferation Project, is one I put up there. This fella here is a monkey puzzle tree. That's a really slow growing Chilean pine, essentially. It's a really cool tree. The needles have basically evolved to be almost like scales. Each one of these leaves can last 24 years before it falls off. It just gets bigger and bigger, and they fall off as it gets much thicker. So, you see huge ones out there, and all the green growth is just at the top, and the rest of it is dark brown. But after 20, 30, 40 years, it starts making huge pine cones, and it drops massive nuts that are as edible as pine nuts. They're more mild in flavor, almost like a cashew. They have a history of being used in Chile as a staple food crop. But this is kind of a hard sell for farmers because you're talking about planting something.
Will still be alive.
Right. That might not bear fruit until 30 years from now. But it can live for 1,000 years and, in its lifetime, produce literally tons of food. So We've got a few other interesting projects, some of which I'll talk about. One of the most exciting is this one. These are perennial kale seedlings from a really amazing breeding population from our friend Chris Homanix. That's Chris. I just took that picture last week in Oregon. He farms at an orchard now. In this apple box is an old Danish variety of kale called Spidsbladine, and it's a perennial kale. It's perennial in Denmark. It actually produces seeds. It's one of the rare perennial kales that will regularly produce seed. There's one called purple tree collards that's really popular out on the West Coast. It's also an old European variety, but it almost never flowers. They can live for 20, 25 years, or even longer. They'll grow 20 feet tall, almost like a...
20 feet?
As long as you tie it up, it'll just keep growing. That puts off the growth at the top. And the taste is good. I think it tastes like a collard, maybe.
So if you whack it off, will it?
It'll sprout and make more. You can make it bushy. We kept some purple tree collards alive for a few years, just taking cuttings of them, rooting them to keep them alive over the winter, and then planting them outside again. But it didn't prove really practical for us to keep doing that in New Jersey. That one is not cold hardy. But there are other ones, like one called Daubenton, which is an old French variety, and that one has really small leaves. It was primarily grown as a forage kale for animals, but it's good food for people as well. And the population on the last slide, Chris got seeds from a guy in Wales who happened to have purple tree collards and Daubenton flower at the same time. It's like the planets aligning when something like that happens, because the purple tree collards almost never flowers. The Daubenton almost never flowers. They flowered in the spring, and at the same time he had things like red boar kale flowering and ornamental kales and Brussels sprouts and cabbages and all kinds of different things. So he did intentional crosses between the two perennials, between the perennials and the annuals, or the biennials, and ultimately created this really big population of perennial kales. He sent some seeds to Chris in Oregon, who had been working for years to collect all of the perennial kales that are growing in the Pacific Northwest. There's a few places where there are naturalized perennial kale, because this was a crop that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, a lot of people grew mainly as animal feed, because it was really easy. You let it go and it just keeps growing, and it keeps providing food year after year. So there's places where it just grows wild, and then there's garden varieties and things like that. So Chris had his own large population, and when he crossed the ones from Graham in Wales with his, and then spent 4 or 5 years selecting mainly for perenniality, but also for vigor, productivity, and for taste, he ended up with a really wide range. And this is just a snapshot of what's available there. And I actually have seeds for that with me. I have a bunch of seeds, which I'm happy to sell afterwards. I gotta raise money for the nonprofit, One of the other projects that was early on was from a farmer up in Ottawa, Ontario. This is a perennial leek. A lot of leeks are perennials, but people haven't been breeding them for perenniality. So in a climate like this, it's probably a little easier, but somewhere like Ottawa, it's not necessarily so easy. So leeks actually make little bulbs. Elephant garlic is actually a leek. She's still working on this project, and you can see last year's dried up husk, and then 4 baby plants coming up from next to it, each of which is going to become a full-size leek. This is a plant I got seeds from the USDA for a perennial relative of beets. This one's from the Caucasus. It's called Beta macrorhiza. This is just a little seedling. I had a lot of trouble getting these to germinate because they have a really hard seed coat, and the first year I planted them and nothing happened, and I was real discouraged. And then I read something about how this species in particular really needs to have the seed coat broken open in order for the seeds to develop. So I figured out how to use a razor blade and just scrape off the edge of the coating without hurting the embryo, and I got about 5 to germinate from these old seeds from the government. And I still have 2 of them still alive that have survived a couple of winters now. Basically, it could be like a perennial chard. And there are some, again, in a warmer climate like this, there's already some perennial chards that will, come back for at least a few years. But there's some smaller leafed versions. It has potential as a perennial leaf crop, mainly.
So it's a cousin? Is it a cousin?
It's a cousin. It's the same genus. It's Beta. Chard and beets are both Beta vulgaris. This is Beta macrorhiza. This is buckwheat, and I think the next slide is Tartary buckwheat, which is another species of buckwheat that's also cultivated crop. But then there are some perennial buckwheats as well. And as far as we know, nobody's really done work trying to cross the domesticated ones and the perennial ones, and there isn't really much energy towards perennial buckwheat as a cereal crop or a pseudo-cereal crop, but there's potential there as well. And we're also interested in growing this Tartary buckwheat just because it's a really great source of antioxidants. Rutin in particular, the highest natural sources in this plant. Last year we grew about 78 varieties, 78 accessions to see which ones would work in our area. And we got about 20, 25 that seem like potential good crops. But just for diversifying the landscape, for bringing different insects in. As you know, if you're a gardener, diversity is a major strength. And for organic farming, we don't use any kind of sprays. Very rarely we will, if we have a particular infestation, we'll use some kind of organic spray on a couple of crops. But largely we just let the ecosystem that we're building take care of all the pests. And it's fun to watch. Watch these things happen. We had the second year we had a really bad fall armyworm infestation on our sorghum, and so the next year I got some spinosad, which is an organic spray, and I sprayed it on a few plants, but it wasn't so bad. And then the next year I didn't, which was I think last year, I didn't have to spray anything because the natural balance kind of got rid of those pests. The tobacco hornworms, our second year, we grew like 25, 30 different kinds of tomatoes. It's New Jersey, so we grow tomatoes pretty well. And we had some rough times with those tobacco hornworms the second year. They just destroyed a lot of our crops before we even noticed that they were working. And then the third year, there was much less. And then the fourth year, we noticed hardly any. And if I ever saw a tobacco hornworm, it was covered in wasp eggs. And so we realized, okay, well, we created a home for these wasps, and now they're here, and they're doing biological control for us. We didn't have to bring them. They found it. So this is a monkey puzzle tree. I wanted to include these massive cones here. I think of it as like a creature. It's almost more animal than plant. I saw one of these at an arboretum in the far northern mountains in New Jersey. We do have some mountains in New Jersey, right by the border with New York State. And I saw one of these growing there, and I was just fascinated by it. I had seen them before in various public gardens and arboretums, and I took a picture of it and made a post about it on Instagram, and that required me to read up a little bit about it. And I had no idea that they were edible, that this was a food plant. So I kind of became obsessed with getting as many seeds as I could. And if it's going to take 30 years, I'm 35. I don't have much time to waste. So I'm trying to get as many in the ground as possible. I picked this one up in Oregon along with a few others that are in my car.
Can this grow in any climate?
I've read that it will grow up to zone 5. I guess this is probably zone 7.
Yeah, 66.
Yeah, 6, 7. So this is pretty much the same in New Jersey. We're zone 7, but used to be zone 6 in recent memory, and we'll probably be zone 8 in a decade or two. I'm thinking about planting some pomegranates actually, because but the extreme cold it really can't handle, and it also it doesn't like extreme heat either. It's from temperate mountainous parts of Chile, so it does have a very particular climate that it likes. But these are really popular garden trees in the UK and in France. They grow really well over there, and there's a lot more seeds. But one of the other challenges with this, not only does it take 30 years, it's dioecious, which means it has male and female trees. So there are some huge specimen trees in this country, and you don't know until it's 30 years old which sex it is. So a lot of arboretums will have one big beautiful monkey puzzle tree that's just standing there doing nothing. But it's the lucky. It's incredibly. The seeds that grew these maybe came from a population in Washington State where they cut down the male for some reason. Maybe it was dying, so there's like 3 female trees with no male to pollinate them now. But luckily some of those seeds got out there. And I ordered some off of eBay, actually, that came in beautiful shape from a guy in Washington State who has whose grandparents planted 2 trees in his backyard, and there happens to be a male and a female. He lucked out, and now has a whole bunch of seeds. There's one growing nearby in New Jersey, somebody who planted 3 trees a while back, and now there's 2 left. I don't know if those produce any seed yet, but they're around. So I'm getting ready to put in a small plantation in New Jersey and get these going. And we're using the Experimental Farm Network to find people in other parts of the country to also establish small plantations of these. These are the nuts up close. You can see, I mean, a pine nut is no comparison. And the next one, I peeled one. I mean, it's huge, and they're tasty. I think there's a lot of potential there, but it's just going to require people who are willing to devote time and some of their land to something that's slow growing. And that's going to be a theme of some of the next crops too. So this slide here is from Badger Set Research Corporation. It's a farm that was founded about 35 years ago by a guy named Philip Rudder. He was one of the founders of the American Chestnut Foundation, which is aiming to crossbreed American chestnuts with Asian chestnuts to introduce blight resistance into the genome, and then backcross with American chestnuts until you end up with something that's, maybe 31 32nd American and 1 32nd Asian, but has the gene for blight resistance. So that work carries on with the American Chestnut Foundation. They're working all around the country. But Philip, for the last 35 years, has been in Minnesota working on his own farm and working primarily on breeding hazelnuts and chestnuts as perennial woody staple crops. Hazelnuts could replace soybeans already by acreage and yield. It's pretty much there, and it can even be mechanically harvested. It's also delicious. This is a picture from Badger Set. They have these long rows of trees and alleys between them, which can be used for growing other crops as well. Tree agriculture, you can really be creating a permanent system, an agro-ecological system. Philip's been breeding 3 or 4 different species of hazelnut to try and develop ones that are incredibly productive, disease resistant. They can be coppiced, which means they're cut down to the ground every 10 or 15 years, and then they grow back from the roots. And you can use the biomass for biochar, which is one thing they're doing there at Badger Set. They make great plant steaks. It gives the system a chance to regenerate. On a large property, they have, I think, about 500 acres. You can be doing this all over and be making, if you have a market for it, you can be making more money as a farmer than you would be making if you had those 500 acres in corn and soy. But it's much more sustainable in the long run. It's better for your land. It's much better for the soil. I mean, we're losing so much topsoil. It's really outrageous. And at Badger Set, there's actually a little wash. I was there a couple winters ago. There's a little gully, and for 30 years, it was a dry creek bed. And after 35 years of planting trees on hundreds of acres surrounding this dry creek bed, it's actually started to run again. And that's like kind of unheard of in that area. So this is a real model especially for the Midwest, where I know from having just driven through it, it's really atrocious. I mean, we are, a place like this where you have so many trees is such a luxury compared to most of this country, where the trees are gone, and there used to be 40 feet of topsoil in parts of the Midwest, and now there's hardly any. This is actually a modified blueberry picking machine that was modified to do the hazels.
Is he also growing them to be larger?
Yeah, oh yeah. They are quite large. That's a quarter there. They're working on making them bigger every year, but
Do they self-pollinate?
I think they will self-pollinate, but they are primarily, it's better to have a bunch of trees around. Philip has a book called Growing Hybrid Hazelnuts, the New Resilient Crop for a Changing Climate. If you're interested in hazels, it's a really good resource. Badger Set is set up as a nursery, but they're like 2 or 3 years behind in filling their orders because there's been such demand, and it's a pretty small operation. So Dusty, my farming partner, has actually moved there in the last couple of months and is going to be helping them improve their operation. And Philip's about 65 now, and it has got chronic Lyme, so he's significantly slowed down from when he put all these trees in. And there's still breeding work that needs to be done, especially with the chestnuts. The hazels are, it's a matter of getting this wood out there, getting these trees out there, convincing people to even devote a portion of their land to trees like this. And eventually, when it becomes productive, they can leave the rest of it fallow and stop killing the soil.
It's my understanding that truffles grow on the roots of hazelnuts. And so, that's where the money is. That's one way to convince people.
Yeah.
What is it, $800-900 a pound? It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, I think there's all kinds of things like that we should be exploring. And pine trees are great hosts for some other mushrooms that are really valuable, like saffron milkcap is one that you never see in the stores, but if you do, it's like $40 a pound because they're only foraged from the wild. But if you have even a Christmas tree farm, you can inoculate the soil and it'll grow those mushrooms. The American Chestnut Project, they're working on timber trees. They're working on tall, straight trees that can compete in our eastern forests. They're trying to get relatively small, but incredibly productive, blight-resistant, large-seeded food crops. And while hazelnuts could pretty much replace soybeans, chestnuts could pretty much replace corn for all of the uses that we use corn for, which is primarily animal feed. But even it makes a great flour. You can make chestnut polenta with ground up chestnut, and it's delicious. This is one of their chestnut trees that you can see they're much bigger. That's a person under there, much bigger than the hazels, but they're really delicious. And they're also working on hickory pecan hybrids. That's another thing that is possible. This is a shagbark hickory nut, there's a pecan, and then this is a cultivar of hiccan, hickory pecan. They got that hybrid vigor. They're really productive, really delicious. If you haven't tasted a hickory nut, they make pecans taste like crap. They're
easier to crack than pecan.
Often they are. I think Philip likes to call them hybrid pecans. Thinks that that's a better name than hiccan. And then even acorns. More and more people are starting to use acorns as a crop because they realize that there's this abundance of food and it's going to the squirrels. There's a guy in Wisconsin named Little John who has a company here, Plant-Based Services, and this is pure expeller-pressed red oak acorn oil, and it's delicious. Some acorns have bitter, tannic flavors, but when you press the oil out of this one, it doesn't have that. It's really tasty. You can use it for cooking. You can use it for varnish. I mean, it's got a whole bunch of uses. That's the tree crop side. I don't think we're going to ever get to a point as a society where we're willing to get rid of bread. Some of us have already, I know, but the vast majority of people, it's just a part of the diet and it's not going away. But there's a lot of work being done to take advantage of some perennial wild relatives of wheat, namely the perennial wheatgrass. This is a clump of perennial wheatgrass, and these are the roots, 20, 25 feet long, compared to annual winter wheat, which makes longer roots than spring wheat. If we were able to get this kind of plant producing food, then we could have meadows that produce wheat year-round, or every year.
You said earlier that the perennial wheat seemed to have disappeared. This is perennial wheat. Grass is actually wheat?
No, so wheatgrass is a different species. I'll tell you a little bit more about that background. So this picture is from the Land Institute, which is in Kansas. And they formed close to 40 years ago now, primarily as an effort to preserve the great soil in the Midwest. They weren't as concerned about climate change at that point because they didn't have a full understanding at that point. Some of the early work that was done on perennial wheat was done by crossing perennial wheatgrass, which the Latin name is Thinopyrum intermedium. That's a whole different genus. Wheat is triticum. There are ways to get them to cross, and there's been some really interesting developments from those experiments, some of which I'll show you later. The perennial wheatgrass, it makes seeds that are edible. They're just very small. So one thing that the Land Institute started doing is simple domestication. They tried to speed up the process of enlarging the seeds on this already perennial grass. So there's now a product out there called Kernza that is really hard to come by because there's not a lot of it being grown yet. That's the Land Institute's first release. And they're also working on perennial sunflowers as an oilseed crop. Sunflower oil, of course, is a wonderful cooking oil. And there are plenty of perennial species of sunflower. The other thing that they've done besides increasing the seed size of the Kernza is still trying to breed perennial wheatgrass and other perennial relatives of wheat with annual wheats. But apparently they're not doing nearly as much work on that as they are on the domestication. You can see it looks like grass seed, but a little bigger. A lot of people are using Kernza now primarily for brewing. There's Kernza beer out there. And these things are still pretty experimental, but they're beginning to grow Kernza on a lot more acreage. One of these seeds is about 1/5 the size of a wheat seed. As I mentioned, there have been experiments with crossing perennial wheatgrass with wheat. This is actually from Ireland. This is one that we grew. You can see it's significantly larger than the wheatgrass. Those seeds look a lot like wheat. This plant was developed by a guy named Tim Peters, who was a quirky, quixotic plant breeder in the Pacific Northwest. He now lives in Texas and is hardly doing any plant work. But in the 80s, 90s, he worked with a lot of kind of castaway germ-plasm from various places and was developing perennial wheat, perennial sorghum. He's working on perennial eggplants and was doing some next level stuff, but on his own. And thankfully, various people have preserved those seeds and some of it is still around. So we got our hands on some perennial wheat. We have one plant that survived 3 winters. So that was a sign for us that, okay, you know, we have something to go with. So now we took all the seeds from that plant last year and planted them out in the late fall. And they're still growing through the winter, so we expect to have, you know, much more seed to work with over the next few years. Just doing simple selection, saving the ones that survive, the biggest ones, the ones that have the best agronomic qualities. You can make something pretty interesting. That's the idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some potential industrial crops. I mentioned the cranberry. So this is sea kale. Brassicaceae is the family, cranberry is the genus. So it's a cousin of cabbages. It's basically a perennial wild cabbage or kale. It grows in Northern Europe, where it's native, but again, there's interesting populations around. So that's some sea kale growing wild in Northern Europe. The orange spikes are a different plant. It's just those big, broad leaves. The seed pods can be eaten as a food as well. They're kind of like a turnip-flavored pea. In Europe, they would take a terracotta pot like that and stick it on top of the plants that grow wild along the beach in the early spring so that they come up blanched, and that's the best flavored sea kale. That's the delicacy there. That's an old print of it from Valmorin, the French illustrator that's from the 1800s. It's got a real history, but it's kind of fallen out of favor. It's not really a popular crop anymore, but it's getting more popular because people are interested in the perennials, and it is a wonderful existing perennial crop.
What would be the zone on that?
Cranberry can go, I think, up to zone 3, maybe even zone 4. They can handle some pretty intense cold, but you might have to get seed from a population that's accustomed to it. This is a pizza that I made with sea kale on it. It was really delicious. Tasted like broccoli rabe or something. The flowering heads, I mean, as you can see, it looks like a little broccoli. That woman in Ottawa who's working with the leeks is also working on breeding sea kale for basically perennial broccoli production, which would be a really great use for it. They're small now, but they're getting bigger. I actually have one that a friend grew. He grew a whole bunch of seeds, and one plant was incredibly vigorous. He gave me one little thong, which is a root cutting. I stuck that in my garden, and a year later it was like massive. It's one of the fastest growing perennial vegetables I've ever seen.
Every year?
It'll bloom every year, yeah. And you can, it will probably even make a couple of flushes if you cut those first ones off. And then this is an annual relative of it, Cranberry abyssinica. You may see Abyssinian oil is like a beauty product sometimes. That's the oil from the cranberry seed. It's really high in erucic acid, which means it's not edible unless it's highly processed, but it has uses in its natural form, all kinds of industrial applications. So it's used that way already, but there's the possibility of working with this one and with the perennial species to create perennial oilseed crops. The most popular perennial oilseed crop, which theoretically could be a good thing for the climate, is palm oil, which is unfortunately a terrible thing for the climate and the planet because the way it's grown all around the world, chopping down rainforests and putting in palm oil plantations, is utterly unsustainable. But ultimately, we should be moving to perennial plants to provide oil for the things that we're going to continue to use oil for. This is I think a 1-year-old seedling of another perennial in the same genus called Tartar bread plant. And this plant already, the root is probably this big, and by next year it'll be that big. And that's a perennial that's also native to Europe. It's more like the Caucasus area, Eastern Europe. And the root, you can dig up a big chunk of the root and dry it and powder it and use it as flour. You can mix it with wheat or other grains to make bread. They call it Tartar bread plant, but it's Cranberry tataria. It also has potential for being crossed with the other ones. There's another species, Cranberry cordifolia, which most people only ever see as a garden plant that makes huge sprays of beautiful flowers. Also has potential as both a food and industrial crop.
When you cut the root, like you're saying, are you killing the plant?
You can take a chunk of it and leave a chunk, just like horseradish.
Wow.
If you leave a chunk in the ground, it'll keep going and regenerate itself. Until the 70s, sperm whale head oil was a major industrial product. It was used for all kinds of things, from candles to lubrication in motors and things. But in the 1970s, with the global ban on whaling, that's not entirely enforced, people started looking for alternatives, and the best one turned out to be jojoba oil. I don't remember why, but I was going through the government's database, which if you stick around for the second half, I'm going to talk more about how you can take advantage of government seed banks to gain access to things like this. On that government database, it has, when you click on a species, it takes you to a page that has all the names in every language of what that species is called. It has a little section called economic uses, and then it says, food, fiber, whatever. And jojoba said replacement for petroleum. Wow. And I thought, that's interesting. So I started reading more about it. And in the 70s, when they realized that it was useful as a sperm whale oil replacement, they also realized that it could be a really useful petroleum replacement. I've heard rumors that there was, that the government was putting a lot of money into researching jojoba during the 70s and early 80s, and presumably it was the oil industry that leaned on somebody in the Reagan administration, and suddenly the money dried up. So the USDA has about 60 different accessions of jojoba that they maintain at in Parlier, California, at one of the USDA germ-plasm sites. A lot of them came from these older test plants and test plantations. When you read the description, it'll say something like, this was the best looking plant from a experimental plantation in Arizona, and somebody went to this big overgrown site where there are these huge plants that nobody is taking care of for decades that are still growing, still producing this oil.
Is it a tree?
It's a shrub. It's actually a large shrub. These are cuttings that I had the USDA send me, and we managed to root them. These are what the nuts look like. And the oil is actually a liquid wax. I'm not sure quite how big they get, but I think 10, 15 feet is probably about it. Some of the ones that the USDA has are frost tolerant. One of the things they tested for was whether they have survived 3 consecutive sub-freezing days and the extent of the damage to the plant. So some of them are, moderately damaged by 3 consecutive days below freezing, and then some survive with no damage, no frost damage. So I was most interested in those ones because even a desert crop, with this wacky changing climate, even places that historically haven't had to deal with freezing temperatures are starting to have to deal with freezing temperatures in the winter. We're getting these unseasonably warm days in the spring, really extra hot days in the summer, but we're also getting extra cold days in the winter. One of the things that's interesting about jojoba is it is a desert plant. It's native to the US Southwest. It actually is said to grow better in drought years. It's something that really can do well being totally ignored. And most of the jojoba now that's grown is actually grown in Israel, and it's being grown primarily for cosmetics. And I've read something from somebody who predicted in the 70s that, unless we have a concerted government effort to get this stuff grown on a massive scale, it's always going to remain a niche product.
What's the disease and pest tolerance?
I haven't read about any particular problems for it. I mean, as a desert plant, they don't have to deal with fungal diseases and things like that. A lot of insect pests that we have to deal with out here, they just can't survive in that climate. This is native to the Sonoran Desert, and it's a native plant. It thrives in that environment. So whatever pests there are that it has to deal with, it can handle them. I don't think that this is a panacea for all of the world's ills, but it's something that we should be focused on, not just for the sperm whales, but to get us off of our addiction to fossil fuels. There are a lot of organizations doing this kind of work with perennial plants. Some are universities. Rutgers has got the biggest hazelnut breeding program on the East Coast because our eastern hazelnut industry was devastated by eastern filbert blight. So there's really very few hazelnuts grown on the East Coast anymore. They're almost all out on the West Coast. Washington State University has been doing perennial wheat breeding since the 90s, and they've gotten really far with it. Kansas State, Cornell, Michigan State, they're doing great work. So I don't want to make it seem like none of these big institutions are doing that work. Badger Set, which I mentioned, the Land Institute, the Savannah Institute, those are smaller organizations. I'll talk more about crop wild relatives, but Bioversity International and the International Crop Trust and their Crop Wild Relatives initiative are working to preserve wild plants that are related to our native plants, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I want to talk some about native plants to this area and to where I live. We have similar ecosystems, so there's a lot that can be done with some of our native plants that, again, people just aren't doing the research. They're not doing the work. This is a plant called Illinois bundleflower. It's a mimosa relative. It's a wild perennial plant, and the seeds, while very small, are also very high in protein and edible. This has been discussed by a lot of people, including Eric Toonsmeyer in that talk, as a perennial soybean replacement or something. It may take 30, 40, 50 years of breeding work to get these things into a usable form.
Mimosa?
It's a small, more like a bush type.
And long pod or?
Pods are kind of curled up. They almost look like, if you've ever seen alfalfa pods, it's like a small bean pod but all curled up on itself. That's what I call it, bundle. The flower is like a bundle flower. If you look it up online, you'll see a lot of pictures. This is a seedling. We got seeds from the USDA for this, and this is a seedling from the northernmost population that the USDA had in their collection in Minnesota. So we figured places on the extremes are the ones that we're most interested in playing with. So we've been getting seeds from that, and we're not really doing intensive research on it. We're just kind of growing it and hoping to produce more seeds so that it gets out there more. And if people are interested in doing a project with that, we want to support that. These are annual ground cherries, but there are perennial ground cherries as well. Actually, Tim Peters, the guy who worked on the wheat, and Chris Homanix, with the guy with the kale, are working on perennial ground cherry as a fruit crop. If you've never had one, they're really delicious, really easy to grow, just like tomatoes. And the perennials, a lot of them grow wild, and they're poisonous when they're unripe, as these are. The husks are also poisonous on a ground cherry. Don't ever eat the husk. That's another interesting one. It's also a native plant. You've probably seen this in your own garden or in somebody else's garden under the name Solomon's seal, but the Latin is Polygonatum, and this is a wild forest plant native to the East Coast, and it has these thick, fleshy, starchy rhizomes that were prized food for Native American peoples and continue to be edible today. But this is something that, we grow this as a garden plant. People aren't growing it as a food plant, but it makes great food. And we could be doing work on more, breeding more productive varieties of this. This is passion flower, maypop, passion fruit, one of my favorite plants. This is another native fruit. The seeds actually produce an edible oil that could be used for cooking or for industrial purposes. The vast majority of maypops in this country just, get eaten by animals or rot out there in the field somewhere. But this is a wonderful crop. The farthest north part of its natural range is pretty much where I live, but I know people grow them successfully as far north as Maine. Chinkapin chestnut, which is another native chestnut. It's less susceptible to the blight. We need to do less work with it to get them producing. It's a really tasty, tasty plant. Those little seeds, they're edible raw, which you wouldn't really want to do with most chestnuts, but these are really tasty. There's also the potential for crossing chinkapins with other chestnuts. May apples, which you probably are familiar with, live all over the place. It's a slow-growing, creeping rhizome. Never going to be an important food crop, but there are large fruited types out there. This is one that I saved from a backyard of friends up in the Pocono Mountains, and I had never seen one that made fruit like that, and those plants were about this tall, 2 feet or so.
What do they taste like?
Oh, they're delicious. It's like, the entire plant is poison except for the flesh of the ripe fruit. So it's kind of a tread lightly plant. It causes my mouth to tingle a little bit even when I have a perfectly ripe fruit, but it's so delicious. It tastes like somewhere between a lemon and a pineapple. You gotta taste it to believe it. Makes great jam as well. But the reason why I include this here is that it's actually a really important medicinal plant. What makes it poison is a toxin called podophyllin toxin. The Latin name for mayapple is podophyllum. So podophyllin toxin is found in high quantities in the rhizome and the leaves and the entire plant. And that was one of the first chemotherapy agents, and it's still used today in cancer medicine. So it's got immense value. Unfortunately, most of the podophyllin that is used in medicine is coming from wild mayapple species in Asia that also have this toxin that are getting wild harvested to supply medicine for people in richer countries primarily. So we're working with this really slow growing crop. It takes about 10 years to grow from seed to fruit. I actually have some sprouting seeds in my bag over there.
And so when you harvest the rhizome, then you're killing the plant.
Yeah, and that's, what we need to do is develop American varieties that are, that grow faster, that have a higher content of podophyllin, so that we can create a sustainable industry with them. It's a plant that grows in the shade, so there's a lot of places that we could be growing it in orchards or in forests, places that aren't being used for other forms of agriculture. It wouldn't be taking away what we would consider prime farmland, but could be a crop that farmers could grow and make some money with, and more importantly, preserve those native species in Asia. Sorghum, one of my favorite crops. Is anybody not familiar with sorghum at all? Sorghum is a grain native to Africa. It was domesticated in East Africa, somewhere in the South Sudan, Ethiopia area. It's incredibly productive. It's drought tolerant, higher protein than corn. It takes about 1/7 the water of corn, and so it can be grown much more easily with much fewer inputs. It can be grown on degraded land with limited fertility, and it will still produce really well. As a grain, it's also gluten-free, and it happens to be delicious. And there are thousands of varieties around the world. Africa and India probably have the biggest diversity. In this country, we mostly grow dwarf varieties of sorghum to grow animal feed. Sorghum is actually the 4th most widely grown grain in the United States. So it's easy to overlook it if you don't know what you're looking for, but once you are looking for it, you'll start to see it around.
Is it related to corn?
It's a grass. Corn is a grass. The genus is Poaceae, which is the same as wheat and all the others, but it's a striking example of convergent evolution. These plants look identical until they get to a certain height, unless you know what you're looking for. Same with Job's tears, which is an East Asian grain crop, seed crop. Sorghum is also valuable because the stalks can be pressed for juice to make molasses or sorghum syrup, which is popular in this part of the country, not as popular in most other parts. But I know people as far north as Vermont who grow sorghum for syrup, and we grew some last year ourselves for the first time to press the syrup. The kernels can also be popped, just like popcorn. It's delicious. It tastes like popcorn with a slight sorghum-y flavor. It's hard to describe, but I like to take a handful of sorghum seed with a handful of popcorn and put it in the air popper. They pop around the same time, and then you just end up with these littler ones mixed in. It ups the protein and just diversifies the diet a little bit. Sorghum has a lot more trace minerals and things in it as well. It's a really healthy crop, and even the syrup is healthier than your GMO beet sugar or cane sugar. This is the press that we used. It's a Kentucky cane mill. You stick the sorghum in the one side, it comes out flattened on this side, and then juice comes out into the bucket. And there's a big, actually Osage orange wood, Osage orange, which I mentioned for the starch. happens to be the hottest burning, hardest native wood. Don't ever put Osage orange in your furnace because it might explode. But for something like this, the swing arm, as it's called, is there. That's Osage orange. And we had a party at the end of last year where after we harvested piles of sorghum, we used that to press. And we got about 30 gallons or so of juice from about an acre of a really poor crop that we hadn't gotten in the ground till way too late. But it still produced delicious juice that looks like that when it's fresh, maybe a little greener than this picture on the brown table.
Did you make it into molasses?
We made a bit into molasses. Mainly we just drank the juice because we thought it was delicious and we didn't really have time because we were doing a whole bunch of other things. But it was a proof of concept. We were able to turn that into molasses. And the variety that we use is the same one that was popped there, is a South Sudanese variety called Coral. We got those seeds from the USDA. We got about 40 varieties of sorghum, maybe 50, our first year, and we trialed all of them in South Jersey just to see which ones would work. And a few of them from this town called Malakal in South Sudan, which has been devastated by the recent civil war, happened to grow phenomenally well in New Jersey, 4 of them. So those are now among the top ones that we grow. We grow one from India we really love, another one from Uganda, a Kenyan one, and one from Darfur, Western Sudan. A lot of varieties don't make good syrup, so we weren't sure this was gonna work, but it's some of the best stuff I ever tasted. So really excited to see what we can do this year. We'll probably grow 4 or 5 acres. This is just some of the diversity that we had in our sorghum field. That's the Darfuri one, that's the Indian one. Alujola is a great popping sorghum. This is a wild species, but also domesticated from Sudan. This is another South Sudanese one, and then that's the Coral, the reddish one there.
White one looks, is it just because it's white, or is it bigger?
Those kernels are slightly bigger, but they're about the same size as this one, actually. We tried the biggest one in the collection that the USDA has, and that one didn't grow very well for us. This is a wild plant called Johnson grass that you may know as a pernicious weed. The Latin name is Sorghum halepense. It's also a sorghum. With a little bit of work, it can cross with domesticated annual types of sorghum. We consider sorghum an annual because we grow it as an annual, but some varieties are actually perennial in the tropics. So some of those Sudanese ones will be perennial if you let them. This is a perennial one from Zambia. And then this is the result of a hybridization between Johnson grass and domesticated sorghum. And it grows by rhizome.
Can't get rid of it.
It's a tough one. Unless you do a 3-foot till and flip it over, you're not going to get rid of it. If we can create a crop that produces an edible grain, you know, it wouldn't be a problem to have a field of perennial sorghum. So this, again, that guy Tim Peters was playing around with this stuff decades ago. Thankfully, a small patch of the stuff survived at Adaptive Seeds in Oregon. And they gave me 2 heads of this stuff 2 years ago. We planted a whole bunch of it in Jersey, 3 or 4 different parts of our field to see which ones would survive. Winters are a lot harsher in New Jersey than they are in Oregon. And we had 1 plant survive last winter. And it happened to be incredibly productive. This is what it looked like when it was starting to grow back. It tillers, which means it makes shoots from the base. The first year, this plant had 16 heads. Last year, it had closer to 30 by the time it was over. We got to do some testing to make sure that the grain doesn't have cyanide or anything in it, because some parts of sorghum have prussic acid and it can be dangerous for livestock. We need to make sure that the grain is edible before we start testing it. We saved all the seeds from this plant, and this year we'll be planting them out much more extensively to try and get ones that can survive. We're also trying to cross them with the bigger seeded annual types from Sudan and from India to try and get a really useful perennial grain crop. So that's maybe the most exciting plant in our field right now, is this one. we really think there's a lot of potential there. That's the first half of the presentation. There's my contact information. Please feel free to write it down and get in touch, stay in touch. If you have a smartphone and want to look at our catalog, it's store.experimentalfarmnetwork.org, so you can see all of the funky things we offer, a lot of which you've seen here. These are some shallots from Hawaii that I just got at the seed conference. This is a tuber for a plant called wapato, which is an aquatic plant. It's arrowhead, and it's also called duck potato. And I'm going to put this one in the pond at the farm, the one that doesn't have New Jersey wapato in it already, to try and get a population there. Native American people would harvest those with their toes, and then they would float to the surface, and it's a great starchy crop, primarily a wild plant, but there's no reason we couldn't be cultivating it as well.